During the first half-century of New England's existence, English settlers and Native Americans lived side by side. The boundaries between these people, as cultures, communities, and polities, were porous, not well defined. By 1675, the region was a patchwork landscape of two radically different ways of life. English villages, cattle farms, and oat plantations abutted native maize fields, pear tree orchards, and hunting grounds. Clusters of wigwams were often found within walking distance of congregational meeting houses. But despite their close proximity, colonists demonstrated a near-complete lack of curiosity about their strange neighbors. The colonists considered themselves progenitors of a utopia. Their movement was righteous, its mission divinely ordained. And what could God's chosen people possibly have to learn from a nation of half-naked heathens? The Puritan movement had defined itself by its struggles against the status quo, and in America, it established a new status quo based on godly Protestantism and egalitarian ideals. But these ideals were never meant to apply to everyone, which became painfully apparent in the colony's legal treatment of the non-white population, and particularly of Native Americans. The Puritans considered America theirs, to do with as they pleased. They had a very clear idea of what their ideal society should look like, and it did not include indigenous people. For most colonists, Native Americans were simply an obstacle to be removed, most often through larcenous land sales, which were only binding under a legal system the natives were not beholden to, and utilized a cogitation of private property that had no equivalent concept in Algonquin culture. But again, Puritans were not a monolith. A sizable minority in Massachusetts, most notably clergyman John Eliot and magistrate Daniel Gookin, recognized the humanity of Native Americans and took it upon themselves to attempt to convert the people of Dawnland to godly Christianity. And many natives were receptive to conversion. These praying Indians, as they were soon known, adopted English customs. They wore English clothing and lived in segregated English-built towns. A few even became proficient missionaries in their own right, like John Sassamon, the protege of John Eliot. Originally of Wampanoag extraction, Sassamon had thoroughly assimilated into English colonial society. He was a committed evangelical Puritan with a Harvard education, and in the early 1670s was actively engaged in mediating the increasingly acrimonious dispute between Plymouth Colony and Metacomet, sachem of the Pokanoket, the leader of the Wampanoag Confederacy. When a group of English settlers founded the town of Swansea less than 10 miles from Metacomet's ancestral seat at Mount Hope, the sachem protested to Plymouth that his lands were being illegally occupied. Eliot sent Sassamon and two other native ministers to negotiate with Metacomet, eventually persuading him to seek redress with neutral parties from the governments of Massachusetts and Connecticut. Unsurprisingly, these arbitrators sided with the Swansea settlers and forced Metacomet to face humiliating legal ramifications. They demanded he swear fealty to the King of England, pay a heavy fine, and surrender all of his nation's firearms. Over the next few years, tensions between Plymouth and the Wampanoag increased. By the winter of 1675, Sassamon became convinced that Metacomet was preparing to declare war on the English, and said as much to Plymouth Governor Josiah Winslow. Winslow ignored the warning. The governor was not fond of Indians, even Christianized ones, and had little faith in their intelligence. A few weeks later, Sassamon was found dead beneath the ice of a pond in the woods of southeastern Massachusetts. The English immediately suspected foul play, and Plymouth authorities arrested 3 Wampanoag warriors for murder. Based upon the testimony of a single witness, a jury of 12 Englishmen and 6 praying Indians found the defendants guilty, and they were subsequently hanged. From the Puritan perspective, justice had been done fairly, with all due consideration to the native parties concerned. A native man's murder was avenged, and a biracial jury had passed down the conviction. But what the magistrates of Plymouth had failed to appreciate was the basic fact of Wampanoag autonomy. The natives were not citizens of the colonies, nor were they subject to colonial laws. They were the independent people of an ancient sovereign nation. So, in June 1675, Pokanoket warriors burned Swansea to the ground and murdered its inhabitants, marking the beginning of King Philip's War, the bloodiest and most devastating conflict in the history of New England, which would end in the virtual extermination of 3 native nations, the Wampanoag, the Nipmuc, and the Narragansett. The extraordinary life and tragic death of John Sassamon demonstrates the limits of Puritan egalitarianism. The man was a more dedicated Puritan than most English colonists of his generation. But nonetheless, when he came to Winslow to alert him of a dire threat, the governor had haughtily waved him away. Clearly, despite Sassamont's bone-deep commitment to Christianity and the European way of life, he was never fully accepted into New England society. The war, which claimed the lives of a horrifying number of English civilians, only served to intensify Puritan racism. At the start of hostilities, a tiny number of praying Indians apostatized and defected to Metacomet, and this led to a general paranoia that all Christian natives were colluding with the enemy, and intense persecutions followed. Soldiers, in particular the notorious company of Captain Samuel Mosley, regularly committed atrocities against non-combatant praying Indians whose only crime was being Native American. And these English abuses were only prosecuted during the war on one occasion in August of 1676, when 4 soldiers murdered a group of native women and children near Concord. The soldiers were arrested, convicted of murder, and put to death. Incredibly, the execution sparked a major public outcry. The war had been so traumatizing, and New Englanders had become so callously bigoted that news of the execution of child murderers was a cause for outrage. That same month, the war was effectively ended with Metacomet's murder at the hands of a native soldier in the Plymouth militia. Natives who were proved to have shed English blood were executed or sold into slavery in the Caribbean by the thousands. Though natives who had supported the English were ostensibly allowed to remain in the colony and go about their lives, Puritans remained deeply suspicious of praying Indians, and many began openly wondering what was to be done with them. Before the war, Edmund Brown, First Minister of Sudbury, had enjoyed long and fruitful friendships with several local Native Americans. But in this 1677 letter to the magistrates of Middlesex County, Brown advocated for the institution of shockingly oppressive policies to control the praying Indian population.
We assert that as to the generality of those called praying Indians, we have found them to be very false, whatever they pretend. If, sir, you desire me advice, we can say our wisdom lieth in first a diminishing of the enemy's number, second in assigning some to a convenient place or places for them and us, third in confining of them to some circumference beyond which without an English guard not to pass upon parallel life, fourth a disarming them of their European ammunition, that by these means they may be kept necessarily dependent on the English, without which we know not how we can be assured.
King Philip's War saw the Puritan utopian ideal come into sharp conflict with the brutal realities of the 17th century world. The clergy insisted that the war had been God's punishment for the sin and deviancy of the colony's second generation. But in truth, the English had been so blithe and arrogant in their dealings with the Wampanoag that honor had compelled Metacomet to violence. It's hard to reconcile the radical libertarian sentiments of progressive Puritanism with the eventual fate of the movement in America. The war demonstrated that this utopian society was still subject to the vagaries of human nature. The city on a hill had faced an existential threat, and from its moment of crisis gave itself over to fear, hatred, and bigotry. The Puritan movement may not have died on the battlefields of King Philip's War, but it was mortally wounded, permanently compromised. And it would limp on for another generation before finally, blessedly, giving up its ghost.